this next portion, I'm going to demonstrate the installation of the Red Hat distribution. Red Hat, each distribution takes a little bit different approach to doing installation. That's the primary difference between one distribution and the other. So we're going to take a look at the Red Hat distribution here. I am back again to DOS. I have made the determination that using FDisk, my DOS FDisk, I'm going to head and look at the partition, and I have once again only one DOS partition that is taking up 100 megabytes on my hard drive. The other 300 or so megabytes of hard disk space I'm going to put my Linux distribution. In this case, it's the Red Hat distribution. I'm back at my C prompt. What you have to do with the Red Hat distribution is that you have to make 3 disks. What you have to do is you have to format a 3.5 inch disks. You insert your CD-ROM, and now I'll go to my CD-ROM drive, and I'll list the contents of the drive, of what's on the CD-ROM. And if I go to the DOS directory, and I list its contents, I can see that it has a number of utilities on here. Most important to us at the present time is the utility rawrite.exe. That's rawrite.exe under the Red Hat CD-ROM DOS directory. Next important directory that should concern us, so I'll back up to the root of the directory, take a look at it again, and I can see the images directory. These are the various Linux kernels that we'll use to boot. We need to figure out which kernel is appropriate to us and put that image onto one of the disks. So the first thing that I need to do is format 3 floppy disks. So I have already done this. I have 3 floppy disks, 1.44 meg floppy disks, 3.5 inch in size. I've formatted them, and now I will go ahead and put the images that I need to put onto these disks. What I need to do is first determine which image that I need to put on. I can do that by changing to the images directory. I'll list the contents here. Notice that there's a directory called 1213. We need to go to that directory. Those hold the kernel images for Linux kernel number 1.2.13. I'll list the contents of this directory at this time. And you'll see listed here are a number of boot images. Each one of these boot images contains configuration of a kernel that probably will match one of your systems. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the file image.idx. I'll go ahead and use the DOS program edit to view this file. Here it shows in the left-hand column the last 4 numbers of the boot images of the files that we just saw earlier. On the right-hand side is a description of what type of system that we're going to install it onto. For example, if you look at the very first line, it'll show that it has IDE slash Atapi or SCSI. In other words, if I take the boot image boot 0000, I will be able to utilize that boot image on a system that has an IDE CD-ROM drive. That's exactly what my system has, and that's the one that I will use. The second column, if you notice, says none. That's because the second column indicates if it has a SCSI adapter of some sort. In my case, on my system at the present time, I have no SCSI drive. The third column, which also says none, is a column that indicates what type of networking card that I have. So, if I have a network card and or a SCSI card along with my CD-ROM drive, I would need to go ahead and preview through this list to make determination which kernel that I need to go ahead and use. In our case, we're pretty lucky because it is just image 0000. So knowing that, I'll exit the edit program. And now I need to put this boot image onto my floppy drive. So I'll insert a disk into the floppy drive, and to make the image, I need to, in other words, to transfer the image, boot 0000.image to the floppy drive, I need to use the DOS utility rawrite, which was located on the Red Hat Linux distribution CD-ROM under the DOS directory. So I can do that idiskd/DOS/rawrite. The first thing that it wants to know is what disk image source file name do I want to lay down onto the floppy drive. I type in boot 0000.img, and then I say what disk drive do I want to write to. In my case, my 3.5-inch disk drive is drive A. As soon as I hit enter, the image, the boot image that I have selected, will be written down onto the floppy drive. Now that I have the boot disk prepared, I removed it from my floppy drive. It now has the boot image on it, and I clearly label it to be the Red Hat boot disk. Make sure that I clearly label that. The next task that is needed, I need to create 2 more disks. That's why I told you earlier to prepare 3 formatted, DOS formatted floppy drives. So I'll move from the current directory, which is on the Red Hat CD-ROM images/123 directory. I need to back up one directory, so I'll do a CD space ... which will move me back one directory in DOS to the images directory. If I do a listing here of a directory listing, I'll see 2 files, ramdisk1.img and ramdisk2.img. I need to put each one of these image files onto one separate disk. In other words, I'll put ramdisk1.img's image onto one floppy disk, and then I'll put ramdisk2.img on the second floppy disk. I'll be using the RAWWrite utility like I did previously, and after I'm done, I'll label the disks Red Hat RAM Disk 1 and Red Hat RAM Disk 2. Now all of this is in the Red Hat distribution installation manual. So once again, I'll access the RAWWrite utility, which is in the Red Hat Linux distributions DOS directory. It's going to ask me which image I want to write to the floppy. It'll be ramdisk1.img, and it'll ask me what target drive. I'll enter the target drive, I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll repeat this process again using RAWWrite to the second disk, and I'll use the image ramdisk2.img. Now that I've made all three disks for the Red Hat Linux distribution installation procedure, the first one I had made was the Red Hat boot disk from the boot images, and then I made ramdisk 1 and ramdisk 2 by using the RAWWrite utilities in all three cases. Now I'm prepared to do the Red Hat installation. I insert the Red Hat boot disk into my primary floppy drive, and I reset my machine. Control-Alt-Delete will do. And here it goes into the Lilo boot prompt, and what we do here is we enter some information according to what's on the screen. For example, I say that I first give the word Linux, and then I go ahead and say HDB, which is my second hard drive. In other words, hard drive B is equal to a CD-ROM. That's because my IDE CD-ROM is set as the slave on my IDE. So it becomes HDB equals CD-ROM for that reason. I hit enter, and now we'll go ahead and load Linux, and we'll simply follow the directions on screen. Notice now that it's asking us to insert a RAM disk floppy. I'm going to eject the boot disk that I created, and now I'll insert RAM disk 1 and press enter. Now that RAM disk 1 is done loading, it has asked me to insert RAM disk 2 floppy, so I'll eject RAM disk 1, set it aside, and put in the RAM disk 2 floppy and press enter. And I'm brought to my introduction screen to the Red Hat Commercial Linux installation program. So I'll press enter here, and now it has asked me to remove the root 2 floppy and to reinsert the boot floppy. That was the very first floppy that we had made. Press enter. And it asks us now if we want to do an express install, which would be the simplest installation. And for this, we do want to do that for this demonstration. It's asking if we're going to be doing an FTP installation. That's using the FTP file transfer protocol, and we're not going to be using that in this example. We're going to be installing from the CD-ROM. we're going to answer that no. We'll move to no. We can do one from the X graphical installation, or we can do a text-based install. We're going to go ahead and take the graphical installation. Now, if we're using OS2 as a file system, as one of the operating systems on our computer, we need to use, and we want to use the OS2 boot manager, we need to take special precautions and special considerations. In this case, since we're not using OS2, we can go ahead and just continue here. Now, we have to have one or more free partitions for our Linux file system. So once again, we're going to go into the Linux fdisk and partition our disk, and that's what we're going to do now. Each partition used for Linux has to be set up as type 83. We'll look in that in a second. And our swap partition we want to set as type 82. We'll also look at that, what we're talking about there. Okay, we have found the following disk, /dev/HDA. Well, what we're going to use is we're going to use fdisk to partition our drive with. We'll press enter here, and it asks which disk that we want to partition, just in case. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the command, and we'll hit M for help. M stands for menu. At this time, we'd use the fdisk utility just in the same way as we did in the Yggdrasil distribution. So let's go ahead and move on. We're done partitioning this disk, so we'll toggle down to done using our arrow keys, and then we'll hit enter to enter OK. And if fdisk complained not being able to reload the partition, we can reboot now. But we're going to go ahead and continue the installation process. It's looking for the swap partitions. It found the swap partition, and it's confirming that we do want to use HDA3 as a swap partition. So it's formatting HDA3 for swap space. And it wants to know if we want to configure networking at the present time. If you would hit yes, you'd be put into a number of dialogues that would ask you for networking information, such as your IP address, etc., like that. But we do not have an Ethernet card on here, and we're not going to set up this system for networking. So we're going to answer this question, no. I toggle over to using the arrow keys to the no, and I press enter. And it's asking where I'm mounting the Red Hat distribution. I'll be using the CD-ROM, but it is possible to do network installation. It has found successfully that the Red Hat CD-ROM and the second drive on the primary IDE interface, which is on device HDB. It's asking if that's correct. And then it asks, what type of mouse do I have? I have a Microsoft Serial Mouse. And it wants to know what port that I have. And it is indeed on COM1 or /dev TTYS0. It wants to know what type of video card do I have. I'm going to use a generic SVGA. And it wants to know if you want to do an auto probe to determine your clocks. We'll go ahead and say yes. And it has correctly found our chipset. And it has correctly identified the amount of memory that's aboard. And it has identified what it believes to be the clocks. We can answer yes to that. And now we can check, select some type of monitor that we have. and the generic multi-sync. I want to select the 640 by 480, and I want to do the 800 by 600 mode, and I want to do the 1024 by 768 mode. It asks which one I would like to start in. I prefer the higher resolution mode. Wants to know how many buttons are on my mouse. And it's about ready to start X. And now it's going to go ahead and bring up the installation. It wants to know what partition, root partition, will form the base of the Linux file system. And we said that it was going to be HDA2. So notice HDA2 has been set aside for the root. That's known as the mount point. And we're going to select HDA3. We're going to edit this information. We want its mount point to be the home directory. So we set aside HDA4 for. Notice that that's how we set everything. We can go ahead and say that we're done with that. And would we like to format these partitions? Yes, we would. Like to format both of them. So now it'll go into the formatting of HDA2, which is our root partition, and HDA4, which is our home partition. Here, the Red Hat distribution scans the disk for the available packages that are able to be installed. Red Hat uses what's called RPM, which is the Red Hat Package Manager. This RPM allows a user to install or deinstall software from their disk. So now this is what Red Hat goes to. It wants to know what parts you would like to install. The basic system will be installed automatically. And if you don't want the complete installation, you need to customize it. So this is what we have available to us here. What I would like to do at this time is we'll turn some of this off. We'll turn the development and documentation off, and games off, and we'll just have X Windows, X applications, some other applications, and games installed right now. We'll go ahead and click on Done. And now we'll go ahead and it'll do the installation process to install the rest of the system at this time. So this is going to take a little while. So once again, kick back, read the documentation manual from Red Hat, and find out more information about your system. Okay, well, now we've finished the installation. That took a little bit of time, and now we're going to go ahead and copy the kernel to the hard drive. And we'll go ahead and set our clock to local time. I believe it's set to local time, but we can always change that. And now it asks what time zone that we're in. We're in US Pacific. And now it asks what type of keyboard map that we want. We want the US key map. and it now wants to know where we want to install Lilo, which is the Linux loader. And by default, it's on the master boot record of /dev/HDA, which once again is hard disk drive A. So we'll go ahead and say OK on that. And it wants to know if we need to specify hardware parameters on the Lilo command line to boot the installed disk. These different special hardware parameters are, for example, like the geometry of the disk drive, for example. We don't need to do that here. So we'll answer no. And it wants to know if we want to boot other operating systems as well. And you can tell what partitions you'd like to be able to boot, and we can label them that we want to. Here on HDA1, which was the first partition on our first hard drive, we had DOS. So I can select that. And I can edit it, and I can call it DOS. I'll say that I'm done with it. And then the Red Hat lists out what the Lilo configuration file will look like. And wants to know what that we should do with this configuration. We'll do an install. What happens is that this configuration file will be used by the executable called Lilo, which will put the boot sequence on the master boot record for us. Now we need to pick a root password, and we'll just go ahead and use Red Hat in this for demonstration purposes here. Okay, now our installation is finished, and we can reboot now. We'll remove our boot floppy at this time, and we'll go ahead and reboot the computer. And we're at the Lilo boot, which we'll just simply go ahead and hit the return key. Which will bring us right back into Linux. So it looks like everything went well during the installation. So yes, indeed, everything seems to have went well, and now we can go ahead and log in. I'll log in as root, and our password that we had given was Red Hat. Make sure that you have your own personal password. And we'll go ahead and begin X Windows by doing Start X. Huh. And here we are, we've successfully loaded Red Hat software, the Red Hat Linux distribution, and we see various utilities that we have available here. And here's Red Hat's control panel, which we can do file system configuration with. We can search our help systems to find out information. We can configure our network, and we can configure our printer. We can go ahead and set our time and date. We can set up a user and group configuration, and we can do package management, which means that we can install and delete packages as needed. And we can bring up various X windows, and we can see different modules that we have. And we have a clock, so we can bring up additional windows. And we can go ahead and we can exit from FVWM. That's the window manager that we're looking at right now.